Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all my guys, gals, and non binary pals. I hope you're enjoying seeing me as I can't see you because I'm not recording this live. I'm also still feeling a little under the weather, but I've been promising this one for a while and I've done my research and I think it's go time. As always, if you're debating a permanent solution to a temporary problem, I beg you turn this off and dial 988, which is the National Mental Health Crisis Hotline, where you can get the help you need. I am not a mental health professional, they are. But tonight, as promised, we're going to talk about the 1960 election. Yeah, I know, problem with my tooth. Whether or not it was rigged. And I'm going to be honest, I went into this research project believing it was a rigged election and that Richard Nixon beat John F. Kennedy. I left the research portion of it thinking, I really don't know. So I'm going to present the facts, and maybe my mind will come up, or you can decide. But there's definitely facts about it that may make one think about what happened. Before I talk about what a rigged election is, I want to talk about what a rigged election is not. Although it does not apply to this case, just because somebody gets more electoral votes than popular votes, than their opponent gets popular votes, does not make it a rigged election. I do not believe in the Electoral College. I think we should be using a popular vote method, but that's not the law of the land. So whoever gets the most amount of electoral votes is the winner of the election. Those are the rules. So I use the law to define what's a rigged election. For an election to be rigged, a state's votes go to the person who did not get more votes amongst that specific state, not amongst the country as a whole. Not the definition I prefer, but the definition that is the law. So let's get into this. 1960. It's the first time I'm saying this. Before I start, I need you to take all preconceived notions you have about Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy and throw them out the window. Because what they represented at a specific period of time compared to what they represented at the end of their political career and or death are not identical. So I may say something about Nixon or Kennedy that might just seem counterintuitive to what you have been taught about them. And it's because, just like most politicians and people, they changed, and they changed a lot. So let's get down to this. First off, we got to go back to 1951, where President Truman had decided not to run for re-election. Why? Because he was probably going to lose. He said it was because of the two-term presidency tradition, but his numbers were really low. In comes Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was not a Republican or Democrat before that time, to the extent that both parties courted him. Both the Democrats wanted to make him their nominee, and the Republicans wanted to make him their nominee. he chose to go with the Republican Party. Ultimately, his vice president ended up being chosen by the Republican Party, not by Eisenhower himself, because he was not ingrained in Republican politics. Now, Richard Nixon in 1952 was 39 years old. He was believed to be very well-spoken, good-looking, and loyal to the party. That's why he was chosen. Eisenhower did not specifically like him, but didn't really care enough to try to veto his choice, the choice for him to be his vice president. So ultimately, you get this Eisenhower-Nixon ticket, which Eisenhower, you didn't get more popular then. He was the winning general for World War II. He was going to win, regardless if he was a Democrat or a Republican. So Nixon rode that perfectly. Almost got removed due to some tax issues, leading to his ultimate checkers speech, which I could digress into, but I can't digress into everything. But ultimately, you got Eisenhower-Nixon, who went on to a landslide victory. In 1956, you get Eisenhower-Nixon, who rides into a landslide victory, which brings us to 1960, the election which we're going to speak of today. Eisenhower would have most likely won that election had he chosen to run for re-election. He chose not to. Whether or not that was because he wanted to honor the two-term tradition, which might have been constitutional at that point. I don't know for sure if that had taken effect yet, but he was tired. And he just went from being a general to being president, and he wanted to go home. At this point, he did deem himself to be a Republican and ingrained in Republican politics, although he still didn't really like Nixon that much. So the Eisenhower vote, I guess, was going to be very important. It is a common misconception that John F. Kennedy was the first choice of the Democratic Party. It's actually a common misconception that Joe Kennedy Jr. was the first choice of the Kennedy family. The first choice of the Kennedy family to run for president was Joe Kennedy Sr. Unfortunately for Joe Kennedy Sr., he was a scumbag, and he was a publicly known scumbag. Just to give a few examples of publicly known information at the time about him. And once again, we're talking about the father of John F. Kennedy. Okay? First off, he had an ongoing affair with Gloria Swanson, who he would actually bring on family vacations to, and was open in front of his wife about his intimate relations with Gloria Swanson. Secondly, during the age of Prohibition, he was a bootlegger, although that's exaggerated quite a bit. A lot of people say he made all his money through bootlegging. Not true. Did he make money through bootlegging? Yes. Was that the source of his wealth? No. I will get into that. He was a fervent anti-Semite. He rode the wrong horse during World War II. He had a relationship with Adolf Hitler. He wanted the other side to win. Franklin Roosevelt fired him from his position as ambassador to, I believe it was France, because of the fact that he was siding with the enemy. Additionally, he had his daughter lobotomized for minor mental illness, of which she had at the time, turning her minor mental illness into putting her into pretty much a vegetative state for the remainder of her life. Overall, not a good guy. So he realized that he would never be president. He was not electable. So he chose his son. And let me go back a second. How did he make his money? For some reason, on the day of the Great Depression, he shorted the whole market. Nobody knows how he knew. There's ideas, which I'm not going to accentuate, but somehow he knew something really crazy was going to happen, causing the Great Depression. And he made his money while stockbrokers were jumping out the window, having lost all their money. Just an overall not a good guy. But he wanted power, so he was going to utilize his family. So he chose his eldest son, Joe Kennedy Sr., was going to someday be the president. Unfortunately, during World War II, on August 12, 1944, Joseph Kennedy Jr. died in a plane crash. So, Joseph Kennedy Sr. had to go to his next option, which was his second eldest son, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, growing up, was socially awkward and had a bad back. I know that all thoughts of JFK are just this debonair, suave man, but that's not how it always was for him. He was somewhat awkward growing up, but he was next in line for who Joe wanted to place into the presidency, so he had to be rebuilt. And he was rebuilt. And the memories and pictures people have of John F. Kennedy are what he was rebuilt into. He was born into money and never had to ask for naught. He never had to suffer. Let's compare him to Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon grew up poorer than poor. He would later say he was so poor he didn't even know he was poor. They had nothing. He had two brothers who passed away in infancy due to lack of medical care that the Kennedys could have easily afforded. His childhood was not a happy one. It was actually quite sad. Richard Nixon grew up very pro-civil rights, but he didn't expect that one. He originally had a very soft spot for minorities who he thought were being mistreated. John F. Kennedy did not have that soft spot. So, sort of what we've been taught about both these gentlemen would end up switching, but were different at first. I want to go a little bit into the primaries of both the Democrat and the Republicans. It was not automatically assumed that Kennedy would become the Democratic nominee. keep in mind, back then, when people would run around like they are now, because it's a presidential election year, campaigning to win specific states, that was for show. That was to give the electorate and the party bosses an idea of who was the best candidate, but they had no legal binding. The candidates were chosen in backroom deals with cigar smoke, and you just imagine. The first candidate for president, and also president, who did not have the formal backing of his party, surprisingly, was Jimmy Carter, who is still alive. So, the Democratic primary, which is for show, started off with Kennedy versus Hubert Humphrey. And it was close because Kennedy was Irish Catholic. And a lot of people were scared that the Pope would be running the White House. And Humphrey took advantage of this as a campaign, what's the word I'm looking for? A reason to not vote for Kennedy. Ultimately, it did not work. So Humphrey dropped out pretty quickly. And Kennedy thought he had it in the bag until Truman came out and said, I do not endorse John F. Kennedy. He is too young. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And chose his own individual to send to the convention, who he thought could easily beat Kennedy. I forgot his name. I will look it up later. Also in that hunt was President of the Senate, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson and the Kennedys very much did not get along. And everybody assumed that Lyndon Baines Johnson was going to become the nominee in 1960. And I believe he would have if it weren't for one thing. He was president of the Senate. So if he didn't get himself back up to Washington, D.C. every day and open up the Senate, the delegates at the convention would hold that against him. However, at the same time, when he wasn't there, they could just say whatever they wanted about him. And there was vote after vote after vote, and eventually John F. Kennedy met the threshold to become the official nominee. And very quickly, he asked Lyndon Baines Johnson, who on a personal level he did not like, to be his vice presidential candidate because Johnson was from Texas and was dirty, politically that is, and could bring, and he was hoping would bring Texas to the Democrats, which didn't happen every election. Let's move over to the Republican convention. It was always assumed that Nixon would be the nominee. There were two other people who were interested. There really wasn't even a primary campaigning, if you would. The other two people interested were Barry Goldwater and Nelson Rockefeller. Goldwater was known to be too conservative, and just pretty much they assumed he hated everybody. Rockefeller was deemed to be too liberal, because keep in mind, back then, Republican and Democrat were not synonymous with conservative and liberal, like they are today. So I believe there was only one vote in which Nixon got the nomination. Nixon wanted to choose Rockefeller as his running mate. Eisenhower told Nixon he would not have his support if he didn't nominate Henry Cabot Lodge to be his running mate. And Nixon knew without Eisenhower's support, there was absolutely no chance he was going to win. So he ended up choosing, the party ended up choosing, Henry Cabot Lodge to be his running mate, although openly that's not what candidate Nixon wanted. Eisenhower then endorsed Nixon to become president. Now, let's talk about what's famously known as the first televised presidential debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, although it wasn't. The first televised presidential debate was the primary debate between John F. Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey. But this was the first non-primary presidential debate. Oftentimes people say that Kennedy had on a lot of makeup and looked very debonair, while Nixon had on none and was sweating. That's for the most part true, except for the fact that it was actually Nixon who had on the makeup, and the fact that he was sweating made him look bad. Kennedy didn't have on any makeup. Anybody who watched the debate on television thought that Kennedy won. Anyone who listened to it on the radio thought that Nixon won. Very soon into the campaign, Nixon broke his leg and couldn't campaign for a good 2 to 3 weeks. And in electoral politics, 2 to 3 weeks is an eternity. Now keep in mind, Nixon was very pro-civil rights. John F. Kennedy at that point was not. So, little historical goodie for you. Joe Kennedy had a secret meeting with Richard Nixon. Yes, Joe Kennedy, the father, met with Richard Nixon and said, "My son is not doing what I want him to. If necessary, I'll back you." Nobody knows what happened after that. Obviously, Joe Kennedy did not back Richard Nixon. He backed his son. But it's interesting that those two actually met. Now, when Richard Nixon gave his acceptance speech, accepting the nomination for the Republican Party, he gave what was thought to be, and I know I'm skipping around here, but I'm not feeling too well. He gave what was thought to be one of the best speeches of his career with one mistake. He promised to visit all 50 states while campaigning. In a system of the Electoral College, that makes no sense. And you could hear an audible gasp, like, why would he say that? Why would he do that? Why? Because that would take time away from his ability to go to the swing states, to go to the states that could go either way. He pretty much had just committed to wasting a lot of time, because certain states were going to go either way. Something else I forgot, Henry Cabot Lodge had ran against John F. Kennedy for Senate in Massachusetts 6 years earlier. So Eisenhower believed that Lodge had the goods on Kennedy and could possibly bring Massachusetts to the Republicans. Eisenhower was wrong, didn't even come close. But interesting little tidbit of history. Now, let's talk about the election and why it might have been rigged. And I learned so much history, and this is going to lead to a lot more videos, but I'm trying to keep this on point. Okay? Now, when I debate the 2020 election and people who think that one was rigged, in which I have a strong belief it wasn't, people often use the word, they fixed it, they rigged it, okay. And I use the question, who's they? And oftentimes nobody has a real answer to that. Here, the they would be Joseph Kennedy Sr., who had a history of rigging elections. How do you know that, Ian? I'm happy you asked. In John F. Kennedy's first political race for House in 1946, he ran for the Democratic nomination against a gentleman named Vincent Russo. Joe Kennedy thought he had a chance of losing. So what did Joe Kennedy do? He found somebody else by the name of Vincent Russo, who was a local janitor who worked at a cemetery and had no interest in politics, and paid him to put his name on the ballot, pitting John F. Kennedy Jr. against Vincent Russo against Vincent Russo to confuse the electorate so people would vote for the wrong Vincent Russo. It wasn't even necessary because John F. Kennedy won by a landslide, but it showed that he was willing to play political shenanigans. Interesting little story there. So, let's go to election night. This, at that point, had the most amount of voters come out. Now, I know I said in my video on the 1876 election that there was the highest percentage of eligible voters who came out, and that still stands. Yes. However, now there were more people eligible to vote, so you had more actual voters. And there were two states which will always make this election questionable. You have Illinois and you have Texas, of which I'm going to analyze now. When the results started coming in Illinois, they were very pro-Nixon at first, because Cook County hadn't come in yet. And Cook County was going to go Kennedy. It was pretty obvious. It always went Democrat at that point. Although you had vocal recordings, which you can still find today, of Mayor Richard Daley saying he would ensure Cook County gave John F. Kennedy the election, or at least the delegates from Illinois. So, just to be expected, they went from being very vastly Nixon to then swaying towards Kennedy, but not at the speed that was expected. Much slower. And it almost seemed like Nixon could pull off winning Illinois. And then there was Texas. Texas was always assumed to go to Nixon. However, Johnson was on the ticket as the vice presidential candidate. And Kennedy ended up always having the advantage in Texas, which went against all logic at the time. There was no back and forth. There was no, it's this close. It was always Kennedy. Again, that made no sense. Even though Johnson was on the ticket, no one predicted that. So, I'd like to talk about Nixon's behavior on the night of the election. It was very close. Popular vote-wise, and before Illinois and Texas were announced, it was historically close. Nixon came out while the Illinois votes were sort of swaying back in his favor and claimed that he believed, without conceding formally, because formal concessions were a thing at that point, that he believed the voters had chosen Kennedy. But it looked like the election was swaying back in his favor. That's something he was never asked about and never answered for. But it just goes against logic. That it really looked like he could pull off Illinois. But flat out said that, looks like Illinois is going Kennedy. And then he spoke about Texas, where the margin was so large, he conceded it without even observing the irregularities that seemed to be apparent, and the fact that Johnson was known for dirty campaigning. It was like someone was talking for Nixon, but he didn't formally concede the race until the next morning, where he came out and he conceded the race to Kennedy. Eisenhower had called him that evening and said, "Do not concede. I believe you won this election." But he rebuffed Eisenhower's request. The chairperson of the Republican National Committee told him, "Do not concede the election." He rebuffed him and conceded the election. Pretty much anybody who was anybody said, "You have a case here." But he refused. The next day, the New York Herald started writing a piece. It was going to be a 12-part piece called "How the Election Was Stolen." After 4 pieces were written but not published, Nixon went to the New York Herald and said, "Nobody can steal the presidency." And they stopped writing. There's something about it that doesn't make sense. Now, an organization was formed without the consent of Richard Nixon himself to recount various votes. Illinois, that was blocked by Mayor Daley. In Texas, that was blocked by Lyndon Johnson. Every other state, they did their recounts, and there was a little changes here and there, but nothing that swayed anything, with the exception of Hawaii. Originally, Hawaii was decided for Nixon by 92 votes, but after the recount went to Kennedy by 115 votes. Nowhere near the amount to sway the election. And it went from, Nixon to Kennedy, who was declared the winner. But just, I find it interesting that that is the only state in the history of American electoral election that was changed by a recount. Was Hawaii in 1960. At a Christmas party in 1960, Nixon privately said he believed the election was stolen from him, which he would later admit a few years before his death. Another thing I want to talk about is the whole civil rights aspect. Nixon was a strong proponent of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, while John F. Kennedy was not. What made John F. Kennedy the civil rights candidate was in 1960, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested on trumped-up charges. And the Kennedy campaign came to his rescue and got him out of jail awaiting trial, of which ultimately the charges were dismissed, while the Nixon campaign advocated for just leaving him in there, which went against what he had been saying up until then. There's just a lot of questions. So I went into this really thinking that it was a rigged election and that Nixon did beat Kennedy. Now, I think that's a strong possibility, but I'm not as convinced. As we all know, ultimately, in an effort to try to shore up Texas for the 1964 election, while campaigning in Texas, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, leading to Johnson becoming president and choosing as his running mate Hubert Humphrey. And then in 1968, John F. Kennedy's younger brother was assassinated, and Richard Nixon was elected president, with his vice president being Spiro Agnew, not Henry Cabot Lodge. Also, an interesting just little historical goodie is that Eisenhower's grandson would end up marrying Nixon's daughter in a White House ceremony in, I believe, 1970. What does that mean? Nothing. Thought you may want to know. So, I'm very happy that I have the ability to research with an open mind. Because if I researched towards one specific answer, I could have easily gotten there. But I wanted to be fair. And I've reached the conclusion there is a good chance the election was rigged. But I'm not willing to say with 100% certainty it was, like I am as it comes to the 1876 election. But one I'm pretty sure was rigged was the 1824 election, which is next. So I'm going to bed. I still feel a little off, but it's been a pleasure. I hope you learned something. If so, put it in the comments. If not, put it in the comments. It helps the algorithm. And I love you and everyone you love. Have a good night.